Hello friends and welcome to CEC live lectures. Dear friends, in comparative politics, previously we were discussing about political cultures. Today we are continuing with this lecture in political culture. It will be part 2 on the topic of political culture. The first session of the lecture will be discussing about grand theories of political culture, especially about a theory given by Almond and Verba. To discuss this topic, we have with us our subjects by Dr. Satish Kumar Jha. Dr. Jha is Associate Professor in Department of Political Science in Aryabhat College, University of Delhi. He has over 25 years of teaching experience and is expert in political science. Without further ado, I would like to welcome Sir to our studios and request him to start the lecture. Welcome, Sir.
Thank you, Amrit. And good afternoon. In fact, this is the second part of our two-part series on political culture in comparative politics. In fact, we should remember that how political culture in 50s and 60s was considered a very important innovation in area of comparative politics and in political science in general. Because the entire purpose of this study was, or the approach was, to see the reasons for stability or de-stability or instability of democratic regimes in the world, and therefore this acquired a lot of significance. Though, as I had mentioned in my last lecture, that culture, the study of culture, is not new to social sciences. In fact, sociology and social anthropology are essentially geared toward the study of culture, and therefore when this new awareness came in discipline of political science, particularly after this advent of behavioral revolution and new approaches, modern approaches which came into circulation, particularly structural functionalism and system, they were heavily influenced by those grand theories of culture built in sociology and social anthropology. And accordingly, we find that this entire approach to political culture in comparative politics drew heavily on many other allied disciplines like sociology, social anthropology, and so on and so forth. So therefore, one thing is very important to remember, that this was not something which was totally new to social science or political science, but at the same time, basically the newness or the novelty of this approach was the way it was used to basically understand or analyze the reasons or the causes for the success or stability of democratic regimes in the world. That how culture, political culture, plays important role there. And therefore, I had mentioned in my very first lecture that what is political culture from the point of view of political science. And I had mentioned that attitudes and orientation of people towards politics are normally considered important components of political culture. So in other words, one can say that they are cultural and social mores of the people and the groups in society. So therefore, what attitudes people have to towards their political system, what attitudes people have towards their political leaders, what attitude people have toward their entire political arrangement. So all these issues become important from the point of view of the discussion of political culture. So therefore, what we find that when political culture as an approach emerged in comparative politics, and this is what I had discussed in my first part of lecture, that was basically became popular with particularly Almond and Verba's that famous landmark study which they did on this issue of political culture in 60s, and therefore this 1963 book of civic culture, particularly Almond and Verba, though in fact Almond had coined this term political culture way back in 1956. But after they joined hands, Almond and Verba, and particularly after 1963, the publication of the civic culture, this entire discourse acquired a new significance and new meaning in comparative politics and political science. Of course, one thing we should remember, that both scholars, particularly Almond, acknowledges the contribution of Weber and Talcott Parsons, the two important theorists or social theorists, or the theorists in sociology and social anthropology. So I mean, these things are important to remember. In fact, before I move further, I would like to recapitulate some of the important things which we discussed in the first part in order to make some connection with what we discussed in my earlier lecture and what I will be discussing today. So therefore, what I would like to do, that I will mention some of the things quickly which were part of our earlier discussion, and one important thing which we discussed, and that is important, that how political culture, particularly after behavioral evolution and structural functionalism, emerged as a very important area of concern in comparative politics. How this concern was basically facilitated, that is also important to remember, because what happens in 50s, 2-3 important developments took place. One was, of course, decolonization after the Second World War, but at the same time, the emergence of an adversary political arrangement, political system in some other parts of the world, particularly adversarial from the point of view of Western liberal democracy. That was the rise of socialism and communism in Eastern Europe, in Soviet Union in particular, and Eastern Europe, and later in China. That also signaled that how these regimes are to be analyzed and understood. That was essential, concern of this entire structural functionalism and system theory of particularly the way the scholars in the United States of America were trying to understand comparative politics and were trying to do a comparative study of different political systems from the point of view of ideological moorings. So that is something significant. But at the same time, we should also remember that this entire political system approach of Almond and Verba, which I presented in my last lecture briefly, that how they built, 3 ideal types, particularly getting inspired from Weberian ideal type model. They constructed 3 ideal types of individual as well as collective, orientation of people in society. And those 3 ideal types, they talked in terms of parochial political culture, subject political culture, and participant political culture. This they did on basis of their comparative study of the 5 nations. Comparative study of 5 nations: United Kingdom, United States of America, Italy, Germany, particularly west part of Germany, and Mexico. So on basis of this study of comparative study of 5 nations, they arrived at this understanding of 3 ideal types of political culture, and they call them parochial, subject, and participant. The parochial political culture they understood as something in which the citizens is totally ignorant about about subject matter of politics. Their involvement as a subject in politics is highly minimal, and they lack any sorts of involvement in political activity. So this is basically, in other words, one can say that this is how they characterize the traditional societies, particularly societies which were not democratic, and therefore their culture in their view was totally parochial. The second type of ideal type which they constructed to understand this entire thing was the subject political culture. And they defined subject political culture as a culture in which citizens' knowledge about political process is not minimal, rather in fact one can say that it is quite substantive, but nonetheless they are totally disinclined to participate in the political process or they participate in democratic process because of a sense of powerlessness, that even if they participate, this is not going to make much difference. So therefore that is the subject political culture. One can say that this indifference was largely on account of the fact that they considered themselves only as consumers of this entire entire process, not the active agent for change, and so on and so forth. The third ideal type they constructed was the participant political culture, which perhaps was for them the hallmark of any democratic polity. Now, what is that political, participant political culture? As I was mentioning earlier, that how Almond and Verba, got influenced by Weber and so on and so forth. So this participant political culture, they define in terms of the combination of both, that the knowledge of the politics among people, particularly citizens, is substantive. At the same time, there is also willingness on the part of the people to participate in political process, because this happens largely on account of the fact that there are a lot of confidence in average citizen that he or she can become the influence, he or she can become the agent of change. In fact, citizens, when they start thinking that they can influence the political process, they can bring about changes in politics through their political activism and political activity, that type of situation results into this participant political culture, and the attitude on the part of the citizens is perhaps this is what they understood as participant political culture. Of course, at the same time, I had also mentioned that how this entire approach looked at these three political cultures and believed that the mixed political culture is perhaps the best one. The mixed political culture is basically the combination of the features of the subject political culture and the participant political culture, which we have just now seen. So therefore, this combination of the two, the mixed one, they called a civic culture, and they believe that this is perhaps the best situation from the point of view of democratic politics. In fact, this civic culture, the features of civic culture according to Almond and Verba are that there is a high level of knowledge about political process. In fact, knowledge so much that people believe that they can be the agent of change. And number two, that though they have immense knowledge about the political process, they also believe that they can be agent of change, but at the same time, the realization on the part of the citizens about the legitimacy of the political system, and at the same time, and most importantly, the necessity that political elites can only lead the society towards stability and democratic goals, and therefore, when they start looking at their elites as someone, a section which is perhaps the source of major change and which can bring about changes or betterment in their lives. So therefore, this is something reminiscent of what in democratic theory normally you discuss as elitist theory of democracy, that people participate, they basically believe in democratic values, but nonetheless, when it comes to governance, when it comes to decision making, they basically repose faith in the elites, because they believe that only elites can govern society in a better way. So therefore, the civic culture according to Almond and Verba is based on this combination of the two things, the subject and participant. Of course, the parochial is totally ruled out. So therefore, on the one hand, the information, the knowledge on the part of the citizen comes from the subject, whereas this entire information, knowledge, awareness, activist zeal comes from the participant. But at the same time, the realization or the sense of, one cannot say powerlessness, but the feeling that elites should govern and the citizens as a whole should be the recipient of this entire elite governance is basically the hallmark of the subject, and therefore they argued that when this balance is achieved between the subject and the participant, then what happens that perhaps that becomes most stable arrangement or most suitable political culture from the point of view of democratic stability and democratic governance. Now, of course, a lot of scholars believe that there was nothing so special about this, because there is a whole host of, there is a long tradition in political thought and political theory which have argued along this line, and starting with the ancient Greek tradition of Aristotle and Cicero, when they emphasized on accommodation, restraint, and the capacity of political process to absorb new demands through this, middle class, leadership and so on and so forth. So this is, in nutshell, one can say that this was perhaps the essence of what this political culture of Almond and Verba tried to do. But the main concern for this study was to understand the causes of instability and causes of stability both at the same time. That if some system is stable, how to explain it? And if there is some instability, particularly when revolutions take place, and you must, many of us can recall that how within a structural functional discourse, there was also an attempt to study the revolution through Chalmers Johnson's study of revolution through this functional approach, particularly in terms of value consensus and its breakdown, that how values erosion take place, and that leads to revolution. So therefore, at that time this was a major concern, and as I have mentioned, as a context of this was largely on account of this Cold War politics, and particularly the ascendancy of an adversary ideology called socialism and communism from the point of view of Western liberal democracy. So this is how this entire political culture approach emerged in comparative politics, and we had some discussion in our earlier lecture. But at the same time, so far the importance of this political culture is concerned, it is definitely very important. Attitude, values and beliefs of the people, the citizens. When we talk of political culture, the moment we have this prefix political, then the thing that how these values, attitudes and the beliefs come into play when they participate in political process, or how they bring those belief system, those values into the political arena, particularly when they engage with the political, engage with politics. So therefore, this political culture, irrespective of what was the concern of these structural functionalists, or particularly those scholars who were under a spell of behavioralism at that time, is a very important issue even today. And therefore, as we will be taking up this issue in the second part of our discussion, that through criticisms, there are many alternative ways to theorize this issue today. For example, if Almond and Verba try to theorize or try to find out the reasons for a stability of liberal democracy, and they constructed an ideal type, that what type of system can be considered the best for democracy. Today, we find that there are many scholars who, through criticism of this entire approach of Almond and Verba, have constructed their alternative approach. They have come out with alternative set of arguments to explain that how this has to be understood, that how political trust, erosion of political trust happens, and how the stability largely results from this political trust. Or for that matter, some scholars like Leffert and others, who through their study of consociational politics in certain societies, particularly the segmented societies, they believe that the stability simply does not come through the attitudes and values of the citizens, but it also largely depends on the kind of political instruments which are basically devised, the way the political elites show accommodation, the way they devise new means and techniques to accommodate various concerns, various identities and various types of issues in society, even in a segmented, divided society. And therefore, those consociational tools, as the Leffert's theory suggests, that sometimes are very useful in bringing a stability in spite of people having different type of political belief and other things. So therefore, many recent studies have been done to counter this Almond and Verba's entire thrust, but nonetheless they remain perhaps the high point so far as one can say the study of political culture is concerned. At the same time, it is also important that this entire approach to political culture, or the discussion of political culture, cannot be studied in isolation. They have to be seen that how foundation for this study of political culture was built in social science over the ages. And therefore, in our last lecture, we had seen particularly the grand theories of culture, starting with Aristotle. Then we have had the discussion of Tocqueville. We have had discussion of Durkheim and Weber. We also talked about Marx and subsequently Parsons' pattern variables, through which he tried to make distinction between traditional and modern societies. Just to briefly recapitulate what we discussed, as part of our discussion of the grand theory till we reached Almond and Verba in 50s, we saw that how Aristotle had argued in ancient Greek period that it is not only institution, political institution, but also the social structure and its attendant value system, like civility, consensus and partnership in political life. These things are as much important as law, constitution and political institutions. Similarly, Rousseau in modern times argued that importance of morality and customs are the basis of political stability. In fact, we all know that how, as a conservative thinker, Burke gave a lot of importance to customs and traditions. And similarly, when it came to Tocqueville, particularly his celebrated and monumental work on American democracy, 2 volumes, Tocqueville argued that democracy is not simply the function of laws, institutions and so on and so forth, but also the modes of society play important role, particularly the way habits and opinion are embraced by the people, and that is basically, in Tocqueville's opinion, are largely made possible through religion. And therefore he gave a lot of importance to religion as basically as a basis, or one can say that the religion creates habits, modes, values and customs in society. And he believed that the religion inculcates a lot of values which sometimes become congenial for democracy, and this is what he tried to study in context of United States of America. But most importantly, we have to see Durkheim and Weber, 2 classical sociologists, the social thinkers of modern times, and how Durkheim and Weber have heavily influenced this entire study of political culture in political science in particular and in social science in general. In fact, we have to see that how Durkheim and Weber talked about traditional and modern societies. In fact, we can see that how Durkheim, when talked of mechanical solidarity and organic solidarity, and made a distinction and associated traditional society with mechanical solidarity and modern society with organic solidarity. He believed that in traditional society interaction is always limited. It is basically confined to groups. At the same time, some sort of cohesion is also attained, but that cohesion is largely on account of commonality and similarity of habits, ideas, customs and modes of people. And therefore what he believed that this mechanical solidarity acts through the process of conformity, and conformity to tradition, conformity to religion. Of course, when he talked about the modern society, he equated with the organic solidarity, which he believed was a society where you had where we have high density of population, competition, increased social division of labor, which was in fact absent in the mechanical solidarity that is the traditional society. So therefore, in order to make distinction between traditional and modern society through this organic and mechanical solidarity, Durkheim basically set the stage for this emergence of the new sensitivity which came into the area of comparative politics after the advent of structural functionalism, system theory and so on and so forth, like Weber. Weber perhaps was another equally important source of inspiration. For example, we will see that how Weber particularly has influenced Parsons, and how Parsons' influence came handy for Almond and Verba and many other political scientists who tried to use this new awareness about culture, about society, about groups, about community and many other things which were earlier not central to the political science discourse. So Weber, particularly his concern with the rise of capitalism, particularly that monumental work which he produced, Protestant Ethics and the Spirit of Capitalism, is considered very important from the point of view of political culture. Because the way Weber talked about the birth of rationality, the birth of the modern man or modern woman, the new identity, because he believed that this entire spirit of capitalism was the consequence of the Protestant ethics, which emerged out of a particular situation emerging in Europe, and that was perhaps the Calvinism, the way it contributed to the economic evolution of Western Europe or the modern Europe, not Western Europe, but modern Europe, one can say. The features of this new ethics, which was basically characterized by the rise of Protestantism, was the success was acclaimed based on diligence. There was great premium attached to discipline. There was a special emphasis on moderation, and particularly the kind of work ethics which emerged. As we discussed in our last lecture, work is worship, time is value. All these slogans, according to this Weberian discourse, basically contributed to a rise of modern capitalism, industrial society and modern ethics. So this is how this onset of new values, new value system was basically analyzed by Weber for explaining the rise of capitalism and the industrialization in modern times. And therefore, in fact, Weber has been very influential so far as this study of political culture in political science is concerned. Of course, because what happened that both Durkheim and Weber basically tried to understand and study modern political culture, particularly the way they emphasize the functional differentiation in society, the way they try to emphasize rationalization emerging in modern situation, the way they talked about this new motivation for work, for productivity, the way they talked about individual ambition, basically replacing the earlier types of earlier attitude of the people. All these things basically became very important for the new understanding of political culture. Now, it was on this basis that we have to see that how Almond and Verba in 60s built their entire argument for the study of political culture in comparative politics. They tried to, because there was already a new churning going on in political science that was to measure stages of development, particularly through a formulation of a holistic model. And it is in this context we have to see that how Rostow's stages of development in 1960s was basically conceived. This is how we have to see that entire discourse on development took place, which will be basically the part of our future discussions. And Parsons, as a direct one can say the legatee of this Weberian tradition, when he talked of pattern variables and differentiated modern and traditional societies in terms of ascription, affectivity and lack of diffusion as a hallmark of traditional society, and achievement, affection, neutrality, social mobility and innovation as hallmark of modern society, that pattern variables of Talcott Parsons was a direct influence on these comparative politics scholars like Almond and Verba when they came to the study of political culture through their celebrated work of 1963, the civic culture. So therefore, the lot of factors of course contributed apart from this theoretical and ideological influences and inspirations. I have already discussed that the new set of challenges were emerging after decolonization, after rise of Soviet Union and basically rise of a new ideology, adversarial ideology from the point of view Western liberal democracy, that is basically communism and socialism. And therefore, what we find that this entire approach was meant to do two things. First, to basically suggest an ideal type for democratic polity, and number two, to basically find out the reasons for instability and revolution. And as I have mentioned that they did it through their comparative study of five countries: United Kingdom, United States of America, Western Germany, Italy and Mexico. And then on basis of their survey of 1,000 participants or 1,000 people in each situation, they basically came to certain conclusion, and those conclusions they try to generalize as their study of civic culture. How they did it and how that has been criticized is equally important, and that will be basically part of our discussion in the next part.
Dear friends, so far in this lecture we have dealt with grand theories of political culture and Almond and Verba's model of political culture. We take a break here, and after the break we will be resuming our lecture. Thank you for watching. Hello friends and welcome back to CEC live lectures. Dear friend, in our lecture on political cultures part 2, in this session of the lecture we will be discussing about the criticisms given about Almond and Verba's model as well as alternative models suggested for democratic stability theory as well as political culture. To discuss this topic we have with us subject expert Dr. Satish Kumar Jha. Let's welcome Dr. Jha for here and ask him to resume the lecture. Welcome sir.
Thank you. In fact, in this part of our discussion, what we'll be doing, we'll see that how this entire political culture discourse initiated by Almond and Verba has been subjected to rigorous criticism over the years. And the criticisms have come from both the liberal and the Marxist traditions, the scholars having both ideological orientations. But recently and interestingly, from the liberal tradition, we find that many new studies have been done where they have tried to provide an alternative understanding of democratic stability and instability, and they have tried to basically go beyond what Almond and Verba tried to do in 50s and 60s through their celebrated study of political culture. Before we come to this criticism part, particularly the way this new theorizations have been done, be it Consociationalism of Lifford or social capital of Putnam, or this entire debate on post-materialism which has happened in the Western societies. We have to see that how Almond and Verba were trying to build his entire argument, about which we also have had some discussion in an earlier part of our lecture today. As I was mentioning that Almond and Verba studied 5 nations, and on basis of the study of Britain, United States of America, Western Germany, Italy and Mexico, they tried to come out this with ideal construct about political culture, which we discussed in terms of their subject, parochial subject and participant political culture earlier. I was also mentioning that what Almond and Verba did, that they collected data, being part of this entire new tradition in comparative politics, which was geared towards empirical and scientific approach, particularly having been inspired by behavioral and structural functional theories. What they did, that they surveyed and did a public opinion survey, and 1,000 respondents they selected and identified in each country, and thereby they basically did a cognitive questioning, this affective questioning and evaluative questioning, the 3 types of questions they basically put to their respondents: the cognitive questions, affective questions and the evaluative questions. And on basis of that, they tried to generalize their findings, which they thought that was not only scientific, but it was highly useful in having a comparative understanding of different political systems and different political culture. Of course, this part of their method has also been criticized, which we will see in the criticism part, the methodological part. But this is what they tried to do. Now, what they did at the same time, that in their study, they constructed an ideal type, and therefore they considered United Kingdom, United States of America, as basically the representative or a sample, or one can say basically countries which represented civic culture in their framework, because there was a large amount of participation of people in political affairs, and therefore they had a different type of faith in their agencyhood or their subjecthood. At the same time, people also thought in these 2 countries that power was evenly distributed among people, and therefore there was a lot of contentment and satisfaction with the political system. Of course, in their study, it was also stated that the Britain was more passive, and therefore it had a differential civic culture compared to United States of America, where they believed that it was a purely participant civic culture. But nonetheless, they argued that in spite of these differences, both countries were committed to democracy. Both countries, in both countries, people had tremendous trust in the government, and therefore they always believed that their participation in political process will make a difference in their lives, and therefore they never distrusted their institutions. There was no threat to democratic system, and therefore they argued that it was basically an example of a stable democracy, largely on account of this type of political culture, the civic culture, which, as I argued earlier, and in their view was combination of both participant as well as the subject political culture. But when they moved away from United Kingdom, United States of America, particularly about Italy, Mexico, and Germany, what they did, they tried to do a study of these countries, and they, particularly in case of Mexico, they argued that the people take less pride in their government than United States of America and UK. Of course, in fact, there is another the thing which they argued, that of course their pride in government was more than Italy and Germany, and therefore one interesting thing is that this Mexico ranked higher in terms of this particular variable in their analysis of political culture than Italy and Germany. In fact, they argued that in Mexico the people had no expectation from government, particularly in terms of the ability of government to make difference to their lives, and therefore they thought that people were not interested in participation in politics. In fact, there was politics of aspiration. There were a lot of aspiration among the people, but then nonetheless there was a sense of despondency. In fact, another thing which they pointed out in context of Italy, that Italy had a totally alienated political culture. People distrusted, there was a distrust among people, particularly in terms of distrusting each other, and therefore they were more preoccupied with self-protection and other similar concerns, and they always doubted the capacity of the government to help them in time of need. So therefore, in Italy, they thought that the people believed that government was controlled by people, by few, and there was no diffusion of power. Power was not totally diffused in the society. In context of Western Germany, Almond and Verba argued that people were totally detached from politics, and in fact they thought that the government was not capable to deliver, and therefore there was no trust in government. Of course, one thing is important to remember, that this entire analysis of Mexico, Germany and Italy in fact has been called by many critics as their Anglo-Saxon bias, particularly the kind of bias they showed through their preferences for the Anglo-Saxon world, like Britain, which is basically equated with Great Britain and United States of America. At the same time, what is equally important to remember, as I mentioned, that through this study of political culture, they were trying to justify the rule of elites, and something which is reminiscent of what the elitist theory of democracy talks about. And it is in this context I mentioned that how they try to build this foundation for civic culture, which is a combination of subject and participant, neither purely participant nor purely subject. Subject in terms of availability of awareness and information, but at the same time, the most important hallmark of subject culture, that unwillingness on the part of the people to participate and reposing full faith in their leaders and elites, which perhaps normally does not happen in participant political culture. So not purely participant culture was basically their ideal type. It was a combination of the two, where the elite's rule is always considered legitimate by the people. And therefore, another interesting argument which we find in his in their writings is the overload thesis which they propounded. They argued that sometimes what happened, that if the culture is purely participant with no component of subject political culture cohabiting with it, then what happens, that the overload problem can happen, and that overload can also lead to some sort of instability, and that overload is basically when people have this tendency to be more activist in orientation, when they try to participate, they try to represent, and when they don't trust their elites, then this can lead to overload on the system, and the stability can completely erode. So this is, in nutshell, we can say that this is how Almond and Verba were trying to do their study of political culture through these 5 nations, which I have already mentioned. Now, of course, in 1980, you also know that Almond and Verba tried to update their study, particularly in light of certain developments which had taken place. One most important development from the point of view of United States of America was the Vietnam War. Then, of course, we have had the student protest, particularly the campus protest in France, and then this economic recession which happened in 70s, and therefore a new ascendancy of the non-conventional politics, particularly in terms of new social movements and so on and so forth. They try to update their study, but nonetheless the entire thrust of their argument remained what we find in their earlier work, that is the civic culture. Now, coming to this criticism part, which is very important from the point of view of understanding Almond and Verba's writings, as well as our discussion of political culture. That what are the criticisms which are normally given on this issue of this political culture given by Almond and Verba. The most important criticism is basically some of the important criticism we like to touch upon in our remaining time. The first important criticism is this on Anglo-Saxon bias, because it is believed that he always they rated in fact Germany, Italy and Mexico lower than Britain and United States of America, show their Anglo-Saxon bias. In fact, one leading scholar, a political scientist, Lefford, through his study of Consociationalism, particularly 1968 writing and subsequently 1989 and so on and so forth, what we find that Lefford demonstrates that the democratic stability can be achieved in even non-consensual societies with elite accommodation and with elite trying to find out a more appropriate political tools for accommodating diverse concerns and diverse identities. So even in a divided and a segmented society, stability can happen, provided you have the political will and you have political instruments, and that depends largely on the elites. In fact, Lefford gives the example both on Western and non-Western democracies, and he asserts that the deft management of political issues in a divided society can overcome this divisiveness, which perhaps Almond and Verba try to do only through their focus on political culture. So therefore, in Lefford's opinion, if you have a proper mechanism of power sharing, rather than the culture, simply a focus on culture, then we can also ensure democratic stability in a multicultural, plural and divided and divided society. So therefore, this is a very important dimension which Leffords try to bring into this study of democratic stability discourse, which was basically one of the concern of Almond and Verba. And of course, one thing we should remember, that Leffords' entire focus is on political elites, the way perhaps Almond and Verba also did, because Leffords argues that political elites can create this consensus, or one can say the consensual behavior, by evolving or by providing an institutional design for such initiative. And therefore, in a democratic, in a plural and divided society, stability is possible through consociational means. And there are many, political, instruments of this consociationalism. I don't have the time to go into that. Be it, representation, a new system of representation through which minorities and the marginalized groups are basically accommodated. So this is one important, criticism and new alternative coming from the Lefford. Another is the argument that culture is not static. In fact, the way perhaps Almond and Verba seem to believe, there is a process of evolution within democratic politics, and and therefore we find that the new means of accommodation keep emerging. But Almond and Verba seem to believe that culture is fixed in time and space, and therefore in fact there is no change in cultural moodings of the society or the attitudes of the people, behavioral patterns of the people. But it has been argued that democratic politics over time sometimes creates consensual culture. This is not something which cannot happen, and this perhaps is ignored by Almond and Verba in their writings. The third criticism is a methodological criticism. Particularly, it is argued that their entire argument or the theory was based on very small number of respondents. The sample size was quite narrow, and particularly in a very short time period, they engaged with their respondents and tried to find out what was applicable for all times to come. So therefore, there is a methodological criticism, and the secondly, it is also argued that for them political culture, this is not a cause of, but rather the consequence of this cause and consequence. They get confused in their entire analysis. The next criticism, which is equally important, comes from the Marxist tradition, and one criticism, of course, is on expected line. That is that they ignore the economic variables of politics. It is not simply culture which should be considered important for people's attitude towards politics, but largely the economic variables of society, which the Marxists try to do through their study of base and superstructure, which at times is referred as their economic determinism. But in recent decades, what we find that a new type of understanding about culture, politics, ideology, and many other superstructural dimensions of politics have emerged within Marxism, and they are essentially traced to the writings of Gramsci, Antonio Gramsci, the Italian Marxist thinker, as well as the French structuralists like Althusser and many others. So therefore, this new awareness about this base superstructural theory about society as the classical Marxism offered, we find that there is new awareness has sensitized them to the role of ideology, ideas, culture in politics, and particularly Gramsci's theory of hegemony, which is not simply when he argued that the ruling class does not rule simply on basis of coercion, the coercive state apparatus, which was perhaps the understanding of classical Marxism. Of course, there is a debate there also, because Marx, it is believed, that was also not in favor of simply emphasizing the coercive dimension of state rule. But nonetheless, this was the dominant understanding. Gramsci argued that it is a combination of coercion and consent which enable the ruling class to rule. And this consent generation through this civil society politics, civil society institutions is very important if we are really to understand the stability of a bourgeois liberal capitalist democracy. And how this happens through ideology, how this happens through manufacture of consent, how this happens through culture should also be equally important in our understanding or our study of the society and politics. So therefore, this hegemony concept of Gramsci, along with Althusser's entire focus on over-determination, that of course there is a determination in the last instance by economy, but nonetheless the totality which we attain is over-determined totality, where we have a lot of components coming from different spheres of life, including culture. So these two new innovations within Marxist theory have also been used by scholars to critique Almond and Verba and his entire approach of political culture to explain democratic stability. The democratic stability which the Western liberal democracy has attained is not on account of attitudes and the cultural behavior of people, but largely on account of these factors, that how the ruling class has manipulated and controlled them. So therefore, this is something coming from the Marxist theory. But at the same time, there is another set of criticism, and that is that there is no importance to subculture in Almond and Verba. For example, there are groups in societies whose political attitudes are in sharp variance with the national culture. So the attempt is made to make a distinction between national culture and sub-national culture, and it is believed or it is argued that Almond and Verba in fact ignored this subculture of a society. In fact, Kavanagh in 1972 writing, particularly Kavanagh is considered to be the leading thinker, leading theorist on this issue of subculture. He emphasized on subculture, and he talked of 5 different types of this dichotomy: elite versus mass culture, cultural division within elites, then there is a generational subculture, then there is a social structure, and the 5th is the attitudinal differences. And he also mentioned, like Lefford, he also mentions Lefford's theory of cultural consensus between divergent groups, and how the division between groups into coalescent and adversarial sometimes is more important or quite important to understand this democratic politics of a society. Of course, he talks of generational dynamism of political culture. In fact, he believed that the generational change of political culture and attitudes of the people. If culture is to be seen in terms of attitude, then the generational change. It doesn't remain static. For example, in where he, to some extent, sometimes is reminded of Jefferson, the great, founding father of United States of America, who argued that to absorb the new ideas of changing time, constitutional validity of a particular practice or constitutional validity of any constitutional design should be restricted to 20 years, because people change and therefore new ideas come and therefore new design is to be put in place. So Kavanagh cites the example of Europe of 1970s, of this change in the generational values of the people. In fact, he argues that this entire value system of Europe was changing from materialism to the post-materialism. Because what happened that from the earlier preoccupation with economic and physical security which people had, particularly between the 2 world wars, largely on account of great economic depression and many other security related concerns, the new quest which emerged in European societies was the quest for identity, quest for self-expression, quest for larger concerns like ecology, larger concern for gender justice, larger concern for different types of rights, which is called 3rd and 4th generation rights. So therefore, this entire value system underwent change in Europe, and this entire value system symbolizes a post-materialist horizon, post-materialist thinking of the new generation. So therefore, in fact, what we find that this changes in value system of people across generations is totally ignored by by Almond and Verba and study of political culture. New politics of ecology, community, popular participation, which is basically new social movements in the European context. These are the symptomatic, reality, or one can say these are the symptoms of new value system. Old generation in Europe was materialist, whereas new generation has become post-materialist. The 2 world wars, situation was different from the situation which was encountered there in 80s and 90s, and therefore the earlier generation was more less prosperous, went for security, but new generation is more prosperous. So therefore we can say that again, if Europe has a recession, economic recession, again value system may change. So therefore values do not remain static. Of course, there is a debate now from Asian value system, that how a political culture theory idealizes the Western values, Western societies and Western culture, and undermines the Eastern one. Particularly new debate on Asian value system, that is Confucianism, how that has led to new economic miracle in China and many Asian countries. This is also being debated, though of course there are a lot of discordant voices like Amartya Sen and others reject this Asian value theory and the Confucianism, the debate on Confucianism, because Sen would argue that growth is due to the familiar economic climate rather than harsh climate than any other thing else. Of course, in this context, we should also remember Huntington's class of civilization. But the most important contribution was made recently by Putnam, the Italian social theorist, Putnam, when he talked of social capital. Because this entire issue of political trust, which was also problematized and theorized by Almond and Verba in their writings, was re-examined by Putnam. And interestingly, Putnam comes from Italy, a country which was also analyzed and studied by Almond and Verba, and they didn't think much of Italy at that time compared to United Kingdom and USA in terms of democratic values, in terms of political trust. In fact, interestingly, Italy and Germany ranked in their studies even lower than Mexico. But Putnam, through his study of social capital, has demonstrated that Italy in today's situation, where we have a diffusion of power and the support for regime, is there, unlike what Almond and Verba had argued at that time. So therefore, what we find that Putnam's 2002 study, has provided another angle to this cultural basis of stable democracy, which was perhaps undertaken by Almond and Verba. Now, decline in faith in government represents a deflation of political culture according to Putnam, and this reduces the capacity of the elites or the political system to achieve the shared goals. Now, what we find, the argument of this social capital or this entire Putnam is that trust encourages cooperation, and distrust in fact deflates cooperation and culture or legitimacy of the system, and therefore trust leads to collective action. Trust in others build social capital, and on basis of social capital this type of cooperation in society happens, and therefore this trust in government can also be secured. So therefore social capital leads to political capital, in other words one can say. So therefore we find that new approaches, new ways of understanding stability, new ways of understanding attitude of the people, new ways to understand the functioning of democratic polity have been attempted in recent years through a rigorous criticism of what Almond and Verba had argued in 50s and 60s, and thereby we find that a very creative engagement with political culture has happened over the years, and that shows the importance of this classic work, one can say, of Almond and Verba, which they provided in 50s and 60s.
Dear friends, due to paucity of time, we have to stop our lecture here. On that note, we would like to thank Dr. Jha for coming here and delivering this wonderful lecture. And thank you, dear friends, for watching our lecture. Stay tuned and keep watching. Thank you.